Just as the vows began, a voice rang out, cutting through the silence. "Stop this wedding! I'm still alive!" The room froze, hearts pounding, as every eye turned toward the source of the shocking revelation. The crystal chandeliers of the Grand Meridian Hotel's ballroom cast prismatic shadows across the sea of designer suits and evening gowns below. It was the kind of event where fortunes were made and lost with a handshake, where the city's elite gathered to perform their carefully choreographed dance of power and influence. Yet on this particular autumn evening, as leaves of burnished gold scattered across Manhattan's streets, destiny had other plans entirely. Madeline Carter stood before the floor-to-ceiling windows, her reflection a testament to both professional polish and natural grace. The deep burgundy of her tailored suit complemented her rich ebony skin, while subtle gold accessories caught the light with every measured movement. At 32, she had already carved out a reputation as one of Wellington and Associates' most formidable sales executives, turning the heads of industry veterans who had initially dismissed her as too young, too female, or too different for their old boys' network. "The numbers don't lie, Mr. Henderson," she was saying, her voice carrying the quiet confidence of someone who knew her worth. "Our implementation strategy could increase your quarterly returns by at least 28%. She paused, allowing a slight smile to play across her features. "And that's a conservative estimate." The elderly CEO before her stroked his silver beard. Clearly impressed despite himself, this was Madeline's gift, not just the ability to sell, but to transform skeptics into believers. Her success wasn't built on aggressive tactics or manipulation, but on an authentic desire to create value for her clients. It showed in every presentation, every handshake, every carefully crafted proposal. Across the room, another scene was unfolding. Rian Edward had just entered through the grand double doors, his presence immediately commanding attention without seeking it. At 35, he had already transformed his family's modest trading company into a global enterprise, earning him features in Forbes and Fortune. Yet it wasn't his business acumen that drew whispers and appreciative glances from the gathered crowd. Rian possessed that rare combination of physical beauty and genuine warmth that made him impossible to ignore. His tall frame carried his impeccably tailored charcoal suit with natural elegance, while his features seemed carved from ancient marble. Strong jawline, aristocratic nose, and eyes the color of a storm-tossed sea. His dark hair, slightly longer than corporate convention dictated, curled just above his collar, suggesting a spirit not entirely tamed by boardroom politics. But it was his smile, unexpected, genuine, and slightly crooked, that transformed him from merely handsome into truly memorable. When he smiled, as he was doing now while greeting an elderly board member, tiny creases appeared at the corners of his eyes, hints of laughter lines earned through a life lived fully rather than cautiously. The universe, in its infinite wisdom, chose that precise moment to orchestrate their meeting. As Madeline concluded her conversation with Henderson, she turned toward the bar, her heel catching on an unseen snag in the carpet. In the split second before gravity could claim its victory, strong hands steadied her elbow, preventing what could have been a catastrophic fall. "Careful," a voice said, its rich timbre carrying notes of genuine concern rather than condescension. "These events can be hazardous to one's health." Madeline looked up, a quick retort dying on her lips as she met Rian's gaze. Time seemed to pause, the ambient noise of the gathering fading to a distant hum. Later, when asked about this moment, neither could adequately explain what happened. It wasn't merely physical attraction, though that certainly existed. It was recognition, soul recognizing soul across the cosmic divide. "I'm Rian Edward," he said, his hands lingering perhaps a moment longer than strictly necessary. And I believe you just saved Henderson Industrial from another quarter of mediocre returns. Madeline's eyebrow arched elegantly. You were eavesdropping. Let's call it strategic market research, he countered, that devastating smile making another appearance. I've been trying to get Henderson to modernize his operations for 2 years. In 15 minutes, you accomplished what I couldn't in 24 months. Madeline Carter, she offered, accepting the crystal flute of champagne he somehow procured without her noticing. And perhaps you were simply approaching the problem from the wrong angle. Oh, I'm quite certain I was. His eyes held hers with an intensity that should have been uncomfortable, but somehow wasn't. Would you be willing to enlighten me over dinner? The question hung in the air between them, weighted with possibility. In that moment, standing in the gleaming ballroom with Manhattan's lights twinkling beyond the windows like earthbound stars, neither could have predicted the storms that lay ahead. They couldn't know that their meeting would set in motion events that would test the very foundations of love, family, and faith. They didn't see Barbie Morrison, Rian's longtime friend and business partner, watching from across the room with a knowing smile. They were equally unaware of the smartphone camera capturing their meeting, a photo that would later find its way to Rian's mother, sparking the first flames of controversy. Dinner? Madeline repeated, pretending to consider while fighting a smile of her own. That depends entirely on the restaurant, Mr. Edward. Please, it's Rian. And I know a little place in the village. Family-owned, 3 generations of culinary expertise, and a wine cellar that would make French sommeliers weep with envy. You make a compelling pitch, she acknowledged, her professional armor softening in the face of his earnest charm. Though I should warn you, I'm not easily impressed. Good, he replied, his expression suggesting he'd just been issued the most fascinating challenge of his life. Neither am I. A passing waiter cleared his throat discreetly, breaking the spell that had descended around them. Reality rushed back in, the murmur of conversations, the clink of glasses, the subtle power plays unfolding in every corner of the room. Yet something had shifted, fundamentally and irrevocably. Barbie chose that moment to approach, her designer heels clicking against the marble floor like a countdown. Rian, darling, the Peterson Group is asking for you. She turned to Madeline with a warm smile that reached her eyes. I'm Barbie Morrison, and I apologize for interrupting what looked like a fascinating conversation. No apology necessary, Madeline assured her, though Ryan's slight frown suggested he disagreed. Tomorrow evening, 8 o'clock, he asked, already reaching for his phone. Unless you have other plans. Madeline should have hesitated. She had a presentation to prepare for Monday, client reports to review, and a dozen other professional obligations demanding her attention. Yet something in his expression, earnest hope barely masked by practiced confidence, made all those responsibilities seem suddenly negotiable. 8 o'clock, she confirmed, entering her number into his offered phone. Don't disappoint me, Rian Edward. I wouldn't dare, he replied, that captivating smile making one final appearance before duty pulled him away. As Madeline watched him disappear into the crowd, Barbie lingered, her expression knowing. I've known Rian for 15 years, she said quietly. I've never seen him look at anyone the way he just looked at you. And how's that? Like a man who just found something he didn't even know he was looking for. Barbie squeezed her arm gently. Be patient with him. He's worth it. With that cryptic advice, she too melted into the crowd, leaving Madeline alone with her thoughts and a half-empty champagne flute. Outside, the autumn wind sent leaves dancing across Park Avenue, nature's confetti celebrating a moment that would change lives forever. Little did they know, in a penthouse apartment 20 blocks away, Rian's mother, Eleanor Edward, was hosting her weekly bridge game. She could never have guessed that at that very moment, her carefully laid plans for her son's future were being rewritten by a chance meeting and a stumble on expensive carpet. The wheels of fate were turning, and not even Eleanor's considerable influence could stop what was about to unfold. In years to come, people would ask them about this night, how they knew, what they felt, whether they sensed the magnitude of what was beginning. The truth was both simpler and more complex than anyone could have imagined. In a world of calculated risks and measured responses, two people simply looked at each other and decided to take a chance on something real. The night air was crisp with possibility as Madeline finally left the event, her mind already turning to tomorrow's dinner. Above, the stars twinkled their ancient light, bearing witness to the beginning of a love story that would challenge prejudices, defy expectations, and ultimately remind the world that the heart knows no boundaries. Chapter 2. Love Against the Storm. 6 months after their fateful meeting at the Grand Meridian, Madeline and Rian's relationship had blossomed into something neither of them had dared to dream possible. Their first dinner in the village had stretched into a 5-hour conversation that left them both wondering how they'd lived so long without knowing each other. That evening led to countless others. Stolen moments between board meetings, weekend escapes to the Hamptons, and quiet nights, spent discovering the infinite ways their souls aligned. Spring had painted New York City in vibrant hues of pink and white, cherry blossoms dancing on the breeze like nature's confetti. Rian stood in his penthouse office, watching the sunset paint the sky in watercolor strokes of orange and purple. His phone buzzed with yet another message from his mother, the 5th that day. He ignored it, just as he'd ignored the others. Instead, his fingers traced the small velvet box in his pocket, a smile playing at his lips as he thought of the ring nestled inside. The door opened behind him, and Barbie's reflection appeared in the window. "Your mother's in the lobby," she announced, her expression caught between sympathy and concern. "She's threatening to make a scene if you don't see her." Rian's jaw tightened. "Of course she is." He turned, running a hand through his dark hair. How did she even find out about Madeline? "The photo from the charity gala last week," Barbie explained, pulling up the society page on her tablet. There it was, Madeline and Rian caught in an intimate moment, her head thrown back in laughter as he gazed at her with undisguised adoration. It's been making rounds in the social circles. Eleanor Edwards' reputation preceded her like a storm front. Born into old money and married into newer wealth, she wielded her social influence like a surgeon's scalpel, precise, cutting, and utterly merciless. Her annual galas were legendary, her charity work impeccable, and her prejudices, unfortunately, were as deeply rooted as the family trees she so proudly traced back to the Mayflower. "Send her up," Ryan sighed, squaring his shoulders. "Better to face this now." Eleanor swept into the office like an Arctic wind, her Chanel suit as immaculate as her silver hair. At 65, she remained a striking woman, though years of maintaining a rigid worldview had carved permanent lines around her mouth. She took one look at the Philadelphia expansion proposals on Rian's desk and dismissed them with a wave of her manicured hand. "Darling, we need to talk about this unfortunate situation." She perched herself on the edge of an Italian leather chair, her spine rigid as a steel rod. "I've been getting the most distressing calls. Mother, the Whitman's daughter just returned from finishing school in Switzerland," she continued, as if he hadn't spoken. "Lovely girl, perfect breeding. I've arranged for her to attend the summer benefit next month." "I'm not interested in Charlotte Whitman," Rian cut in, his voice carrying the same steel that had made him a formidable force in the business world. "Or any other society debutante you're planning to parade in front of me." Eleanor's perfectly painted lips pressed into a thin line. "This isn't about what you want, darling. This is about legacy, responsibility. The Edward name means something in this city." "You're right," he agreed, surprising her. "It does mean something. which is why I won't let it be associated with bigotry and outdated prejudices. Bigotry? Eleanor's voice rose an octave. I'm trying to protect you. Do you have any idea what people are saying? The boards you sit on, the clubs you belong to, they have standards, Rian. Standards, he barked out, a laugh devoid of humor. Let me tell you about Madeline Carter. She graduated summa cum laude from Columbia Business School. She single-handedly revolutionized corporate sales strategies across 3 continents. She speaks 4 languages, serves on 2 charitable foundations, and has more integrity in her little finger than half the social circle you're so desperate to impress. She's also black? Rian's voice cut through the air like a whip. Is that what you're struggling to say, Mother? Because if it is, I suggest you take a long, hard look at what that prejudice says about you, not her. Eleanor rose, her hands trembling slightly. I will not stand here and be lectured on morality by my own son. That girl, that woman, Rian corrected, is the person I love, the person I intend to marry. The silence that followed was absolute. Eleanor's face drained of color as her gaze fixed on the velvet box Rian had withdrawn from his pocket. You can't be serious. I've never been more serious about anything in my life. I forbid it. The words hung in the air between them, archaic and ridiculous in the gleaming modern office. Rian's laugh was genuine this time, if tinged with sadness. I'm not asking for permission, Mother. I'm 35 years old and CEO of my own company. I'm telling you what's going to happen, and you have 2 choices. Accept it and be part of our lives, or don't, and miss out on everything that follows. You would choose her over your own mother, over your family? You're the one making this a choice, not me. He moved around the desk, taking her hands in his despite her attempt to pull away. Mom, please, meet her, talk to her. Give her a chance to show you the person she is, not whatever prejudiced image you've constructed. For a moment, something flickered in Eleanor's eyes, uncertainty perhaps, or a glimmer of the mother who used to read him bedtime stories and kiss his scraped knees. But then her expression hardened, masks sliding back into place like armor. If you do this, she said, each word precisely enunciated, you will destroy everything your father and I built, our reputation, our social standing, things that matter far less to me than love and basic human decency. Eleanor withdrew her hands as if burned. Then you leave me no choice. She moved toward the door, pausing with her hand on the handle. When this ends badly, and it will, don't come crying to me. The door closed behind her with a quiet click that somehow hurt more than a slam would have. Rian stood motionless, the velvet box warm in his palm as the sun finally surrendered to the horizon. Barbie slipped back into the office, her heels silent on the thick carpet. Well, that went about as well as expected. She placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. Are you okay? I knew it would be bad, he admitted, sinking into his chair. I just didn't expect... Actually, no. This is exactly what I expected. I just hoped I was wrong. Have you told Madeline about your mother yet? Not everything. He rubbed his face wearily. How do you tell the woman you love that your mother's greatest objection to your relationship is the color of her skin in 2024? The same way Madeline handles everything, with grace, strength, and probably a spreadsheet analyzing the sociological implications. Barbie's attempt at humor drew a small smile from him. She's stronger than you give her credit for, Rian, and she deserves to know what she's walking into. He nodded, knowing his friend was right. The ring box seemed to grow heavier in his pocket, a reminder of all that was at stake. Yet even as his mother's words echoed in his mind, Rian felt an unexpected sense of peace. For the first time in his life, he was absolutely certain about his path forward. That evening, As Manhattan's lights began their nightly dance against the darkening sky, Rian made his way to Madeline's brownstone in the West Village. Each step felt like movement toward his true north, every block between his office and her door, a distance between who he was raised to be and who he chose to become. Madeline opened the door in comfortable loungewear, her natural hair framing her face like a halo in the soft porch light. One look at his expression told her everything she needed to know. "Your mother found out," she said simply, stepping aside to let him in. "How did you know?" "Because I've lived in this skin for 32 years, Rian." She led him to her cozy living room, where case files and market reports shared space with art books and fresh flowers. "I know what it looks like when someone's world has been shaken by other people's prejudices." He caught her hand, pulling her close. "I wish I could shield you from this." "I don't need shielding," she smiled, touching his cheek gently. "I need a partner who stands with me, not in front of me, and you've proven yourself to be exactly that." In that moment, looking into her eyes that held nothing but strength and love, Rian knew he couldn't wait for the elaborate proposal he'd planned. This moment, honest, raw and real, was perfect in its imperfection. He sank to one knee, drawing the velvet box from his pocket. Madeline's breath caught, her free hand flying to her throat. "Madeline Carter," he began, his voice rough with emotion, "I love you. Not despite anything or because of anything, but simply and completely for who you are. The world might throw storms at us, but there's no one I'd rather weather them with. Will you marry me?" The ring caught the light as he opened the box, a stunning oval diamond set in platinum, surrounded by smaller stones that created a starburst effect. But it was Madeline's smile that truly lit up the room. "Yes," she whispered, then louder, "Yes!" As he slipped the ring onto her finger, they both knew this was just the beginning. There would be battles ahead, with society, with family, with a world that sometimes seemed determined to keep hearts apart. But in that moment, love felt like the strongest force in the universe, capable of moving mountains and changing minds. Outside, a spring rain began to fall, washing the city streets clean. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but tonight belonged to them. Two souls who chose love over fear, courage over conformity, and each other over everything else. If you're enjoying this emotional journey, please subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications to never miss our upcoming heart-touching stories. Your support means the world to us. Let's continue with this gripping tale. Chapter 3. Treachery and Truth. The wedding was everything a fairy tale should be and more. The Metropolitan Museum of Art's Temple of Dendur glowed with thousands of floating candles, their light dancing across the ancient stone walls like stars fallen to earth. White orchids cascaded from crystal chandeliers, their delicate petals catching the golden light. The guest list read like a who's who of New York society, though one notable absence cast a shadow only the bride and groom could see. Madeline was a vision in her custom Vera Wang gown, its intricate lace details emphasizing her natural grace. As she walked down the aisle, Rian's tears fell unashamedly. "You're stunning," he whispered when she reached him, his voice carrying through the perfect acoustics of the ancient temple. The celebration lasted well into the night, with Barbie's toast bringing both laughter and tears. "To love that knows no boundaries," she'd said, raising her champagne flute, "and to two people brave enough to fight for it." But even as the newlyweds danced their first dance to At Last, Eleanor Edward was setting her plan in motion. In her penthouse apartment, she met with James Morton, the Edwards' longtime driver. His weathered face showed the strain of what she was asking. "Mrs. Edward, I've served your family for 20 years, he protested weakly. "And you'll be generously compensated for 20 more, Eleanor replied, sliding a check across her mahogany desk. The amount made his eyes widen. All you have to do is ensure the car malfunctions at the right moment. The river will do the rest. The honeymoon destination was a secluded eco-resort in the Adirondacks, chosen for its pristine wilderness and promise of privacy. The morning sun painted the mountains in shades of emerald and gold as Madeline and Rian enjoyed breakfast on their private deck. "I could get used to this," Madeline smiled, stealing a bite of Rian's Belgian waffle. "Well, Mrs. Edward," he grinned, the name still new and wonderful on his tongue, "we have 2 whole weeks to—" His phone rang, cutting through the peaceful morning. Eleanor's name flashed on the screen. Rian almost declined the call, but something made him answer. "Mom?" The sound of labored breathing came through the speaker. "Rian, I need— hospital." The line went dead. "What's wrong?" Madeline asked, seeing his face pale. "She's in the hospital. Something's wrong." He ran his hands through his hair, conflicted. "I should— go," Madeline said firmly. "She's still your mother. I'll follow tomorrow." The goodbye kiss was tender, neither knowing it would be their last for months. As Rian's car disappeared down the mountain road, James Morton watched from the service entrance, his hand shaking as he made the call. "He's gone," he reported. "Good," Eleanor's perfectly healthy voice replied. "You know what to do." The afternoon sun was setting when James approached Madeline with carefully crafted concern. "Mrs. Edward, there's something wrong with the car. I've called a mechanic, but my family lives nearby. I could stay with them tonight and return in the morning to drive you to the city." Madeline considered her options. The resort was isolated, and she was eager to reach Rian. "I can drive myself," she decided. "Just show me what to watch out for." James nodded, his guilt almost overwhelming as he watched her slide behind the wheel. He'd disabled the brakes to fail gradually. They would work until they didn't. The river bend was 3 miles down the mountain road. His hands shook as he gave her directions. The sun had just disappeared behind the mountains when Madeline reached the curve. The brake pedal went soft under her foot, then completely slack. Her heart lurched as the car picked up speed, the guardrail approaching too fast. Time seemed to slow. She could see the last rays of sun glinting off the river below, could hear her own breath, surprisingly calm, could feel the weight of her wedding ring on her finger. Then the world tilted, glass shattered, and the cold river rushed up to meet her. The water was shockingly cold, shocking her system even as the car began to sink. Training from a long-ago swimming class kicked in. "Don't panic, wait for pressure to equalize." Her seatbelt stuck, then finally released. The driver's window had shattered on impact, her escape route. But the current was strong, the water dark and disorienting. Her lungs screamed for air as she fought against the river's pull. Just when spots began dancing in her vision, strong arms wrapped around her waist, pulling her toward the surface. Marcus Chen, a local fisherman, had seen the car go in. He dove without hesitation, his powerful strokes cutting through the current. Together, they broke the surface, Madeline gasping for air as Marcus dragged her to shore. "Easy," he soothed, wrapping his jacket around her shivering shoulders. "You're safe now." But as consciousness faded, Madeline knew one thing with crystal clarity. This had been no accident. In New York, Eleanor's performance was Oscar-worthy. She'd checked herself into the hospital with chest pains that mysteriously resolved once Ryan arrived. Now she watched her son pace the waiting room, phone pressed to his ear. "She's not answering," he muttered, worry etching lines around his eyes. "I'm sure she's fine," Eleanor soothed, even as her phone buzzed with James's message. "It's done." But destiny had other plans. While Marcus Chen was pulling Madeline from the river, his teenage daughter was filming the rescue on her phone, footage that would later prove crucial. And while Madeline was fighting for her life in a small Adirondack clinic, she was also fighting to understand the truth. The truth would emerge like the sun after a storm, harsh and revealing. James Morton's conscience would prove stronger than his greed. The carefully edited security footage from the resort would be recovered, and Eleanor's perfectly constructed plan would crumble like a house of cards in a hurricane. But for now, as night fell over New York City, two hearts beat in agonized separation. Rian, believing his wife delayed by weather and poor reception, and Madeline recovering in a stranger's cabin, her love for Rian warring with the devastating knowledge that his own mother had tried to kill her. The moon rose over the Adirondacks, its light touching both the peaceful hospital where Eleanor plotted and the humble cabin where Madeline fought to survive. Neither knew that this night was just the beginning of a story that would test the very limits of love, forgiveness, and redemption. Far below the city streets, in the tunnels of the subway system, a homeless man found a waterlogged purse washed up from a drainage pipe. Inside, among credit cards and running makeup, was a wedding photo, a beautiful black woman in white lace laughing in the arms of a man who looked at her like she was his whole world. The man carefully dried the photo and tucked it into his coat. Something told him this story wasn't over yet. Thunder rolled across the mountains as Madeline, wrapped in borrowed blankets, began to plan. She had survived for a reason. Love had given her strength, but now justice would give her purpose. Eleanor Edward would learn that she had underestimated the wrong woman. In his Manhattan penthouse, Ryan finally slept, his dreams haunted by a sense of wrongness he couldn't place. On his nightstand, his phone lit up with a breaking news alert. Car found in Adirondack River, no body recovered. But the sleeping man didn't see it, couldn't know that miles away his wife was very much alive, and their story was about to take its most dramatic turn yet. Chapter 4. Truth Unveiled. 3 months passed like a winter's shadow, dark and lingering. The headlines had faded, the search teams had withdrawn, and New York's elite had moved on to fresher scandals. But in the Edward penthouse, grief hung like a shroud over every pristine surface. Rian had become a ghost of himself. His once immaculate appearance had given way to a perpetual stubble and hollow eyes that spoke of sleepless nights. The company ran on autopilot while he spent hours in Madeline's old office, surrounded by the lingering scent of her perfume and the echo of her laugh. Barbie watched her friend's descent with growing concern. Something about the accident hadn't sat right with her from the beginning. The timing was too convenient, the circumstances too neat. But every time she tried to voice her suspicions, Eleanor appeared like a silver-haired sentinel, armed with sedatives and society doctors. "You need to move forward, darling," Eleanor urged one grey morning, placing the morning paper in front of her son. The society pages showed a smiling blonde debutante. "Ava Huntington's charity gala is next week. She specifically asked if you'd attend." Rian's laugh was hollow. "Move forward? It's been 12 weeks since I lost my wife, Mother. 12 weeks since—" His voice cracked. "I still reach for her every morning." Eleanor's mask slipped for just a moment, guilt flickering across her features before disappearing behind practiced concern. "Which is exactly why you need this. Madeline would want—" "Don't." Ryan's voice cut through the air like a blade. "Don't you dare presume to know what Madeline would want." But Eleanor Edward was nothing if not persistent. She orchestrated a meeting with the family lawyer, who arrived with papers discussing the legal definition of death in absentia. She filled the penthouse with fresh flowers, erasing every trace of Madeline's presence. And finally, she announced the engagement party. "You can't be serious," Barbie confronted her in the marble foyer. "He's still wearing his wedding ring." "Life moves on," Eleanor replied coldly. "The Edward name must continue. I've already booked the plaza." What Eleanor didn't know was that fate had other plans. In the modest apartment above a fish market in the Adirondacks, Madeline was preparing for war. Marcus Chen had done more than save her life that day. He and his daughter Mai had given her shelter, helped her recover, and most importantly, kept her survival secret while she gathered evidence. Mai's viral video of the rescue had been just the beginning. The security footage from the resort finally came through, Mai announced, her laptop casting a blue glow in the pre-dawn light. At 17, she was a technical prodigy with a passion for justice. Watch this. The grainy footage showed James Morton tampering with the car's brake lines. Another clip captured his phone call immediately after. Digital forensics recovered text messages, bank transfers, a web of evidence leading directly to Eleanor Edwards' manicured doorstep. "It's enough," Madeline said quietly, touching her wedding ring. "More than enough." The preparation had been meticulous. Detective Sarah Rodriguez, who had never believed the accident theory, had built an airtight case. James Morton, faced with overwhelming evidence and his own conscience, had agreed to testify. Everything was in place. The night of the engagement party arrived draped in autumn mist. The plaza's grand ballroom glittered with New York's finest, though many guests whispered behind their champagne flutes about the unseemly haste of the occasion. Ryan stood like a statue near the orchestra, his tailored tuxedo hanging slightly loose on his frame. Ava Huntington clung to his arm, her diamond bracelet glinting as brightly as her practiced smile. But his eyes were distant, seeing another party, another woman, another life. Eleanor held court near the champagne fountain, her silver gown matching her hair. Everything was proceeding according to plan. In 10 minutes, the engagement would be announced. The Edward legacy would be secured. Her son would be saved from his unfortunate choice. The first sign that something was wrong came when Barbie's glass slipped from her fingers, shattering on the marble floor. She was staring at her phone, her face pale. Then Detective Rodriguez walked in, accompanied by 2 uniformed officers. "Mrs. Eleanor Edward." The detective's voice carried across the suddenly quiet room. "You're under arrest for attempted murder." The doors to the grand ballroom swung open. Madeline stood in the entrance, alive and radiant in a deep blue gown that made her skin glow like burnished gold. Behind her, Marcus and Mai Chen stood with their evidence, while James Morton hung his head in shame. The silence was absolute. Glasses stopped clinking. The orchestra's last note hung in the air like suspended crystal. 200 of New York's elite held their breath as Madeline walked forward, her heels clicking against marble in perfect rhythm. Ryan stumbled forward, his face a canvas of disbelief, hope, and devastating love. "Madeleine!" His voice broke on her name. "My God, Madeleine!" She caught him as his knees buckled, her arms as strong and sure as the day they met. "I'm here, my love, I'm here." Their reunion kiss was witnessed by New York's finest, captured by dozens of phones, and would be talked about for years to come. But neither of them noticed anything beyond the miracle of being in each other's arms again. Eleanor's mask finally shattered. "You!" she shrieked, lunging forward, only to be restrained by the officers. "You were supposed to die. That river should have—" She caught herself too late. "Thank you, Mrs. Edward." Detective Rodriguez smiled coldly, nodding to her officers. "That will be your confession." What followed was chaos, orchestrated like a symphony. Eleanor was led away in handcuffs, her perfectly coiffed hair falling around her face like a broken crown. James Morton surrendered quietly, his relief evident as he unburdened his conscience. Ava Huntington slipped away in the confusion, already composing tweets about how she'd had no idea. But in the eye of the storm, Ryan and Madeline remained locked in their own world. His hands traced her face as if memorizing it anew. "I thought... they told me..." "I know," she soothed, catching his tears with gentle fingers. "I'm so sorry for the pain you endured, but I had to make sure she could never hurt us again." "How did you survive? Where have you been?" Marcus stepped forward then, Mai beside him. Perhaps we could help explain. The story unfolded like a thriller. The rescue, the recovery, the investigation. Mai's video footage played on phones throughout the ballroom. Bank records were passed around like cocktail napkins. The society pages would feast on this scandal for months. I would have thrown away everything, Rian whispered later, when they finally had a moment alone on the plaza's terrace. The company, the name, all of it. None of it means anything without you. Madeline's smile was gentle as she straightened his bow tie. I know, that's exactly why I had to fight to keep it all for us. Our love story deserves more than tragedy. It deserves triumph. Inside, Barbie was already handling damage control like the PR genius she was. By morning, the story would be everywhere. Love conquers all, attempted murder plot, foiled by brave wife and local heroes. The Chens would be celebrated as heroes. Eleanor's social fall would be spectacular and complete. But most importantly, truth and justice had prevailed. As midnight approached, snow began to fall over Manhattan, dusting the city in pristine white. On the terrace, Rian and Madeline danced to their wedding song, her head on his shoulder, his arms holding her close enough to feel her heartbeat. I love you, he murmured into her hair. More than yesterday, less than tomorrow. I love you too, she replied, looking up at him with eyes that held both strength and tenderness. Enough to fight death itself to return to you. Above them, stars peeked through parting clouds, witnesses to a love story that had triumphed over prejudice, hatred, and even death itself. In the years to come, their story would be told as a testament to the power of love and the triumph of truth over darkness. The young valet who had found Madeline's waterlogged purse months ago stood at attention near the plaza's entrance. As the happy couple passed by, Madeline pressed something into his hand, a generous check and a note that read, "Thank you for keeping our story safe." He smiled, touching the dried wedding photo he still carried in his pocket. Some stories, he thought, were meant to have happy endings. In her holding cell, Eleanor Edwards stared at the blank wall, her perfect world crumbling around her. But even in her defeat, she couldn't deny the truth she'd seen in that ballroom. A love so pure and powerful, it had overcome every obstacle she'd placed in its path. Perhaps in time, that truth would set her free from her own prejudices. As their car wound through the snow-dusted streets of Manhattan, Madeline and Ryan held hands, their wedding rings catching the light of passing street lamps. Tomorrow would bring press conferences, legal proceedings, and the long process of healing. But tonight belonged to them, two hearts that had found their way back to each other against all odds. The city slept under its blanket of snow, while in a penthouse high above Park Avenue, love wrote another chapter in its eternal story. Sometimes, when darkness seems complete, it only serves to make the light shine brighter. And sometimes what appears to be an ending is really just the beginning of something even more beautiful. A fisherman saved my life, Madeline continued. Abdul Rahman and his family nursed me back to health when I had nothing, not even my memories. But love was stronger than amnesia, stronger than your mother's schemes, stronger than death itself. Marcus Wilson, the driver, had been found in Bangkok by a private investigator James had hired. Confronted with evidence of the offshore payments, he'd confessed everything. James now stepped forward, holding an envelope. The proof is all here, Rian. Bank transfers, communications, the whole plot. The cathedral erupted in chaos. Ava fled down the aisle, her perfect wedding destroyed. Society matrons clutched their pearls in shock. But at the center of the storm, Rian and Madeline stood in their own pocket of calm, remembering another moment when they'd created their own world in the midst of chaos. I thought I'd lost you, he whispered, reaching for her. Never, she replied. Our love is stronger than their hate. Eleanor's carefully constructed facade finally shattered. She'll destroy everything, she shrieked, rising from her wheelchair in her rage, forgetting to pretend she was ill. The Edward name, our legacy, our standing in society. No, Mother, Rian said, his voice hard as he pulled Madeline close. You've destroyed yourself. With your prejudice, your schemes, your lies. You stopped being my mother the day you tried to kill my wife. The police had been quietly summoned. As they led Eleanor away, her screams echoing off the cathedral's ancient stones, she was still ranting about family legacy and societal standing. Her perfectly coiffed hair had come undone, making her look as unhinged on the outside as she was within. Madeline told her story to the stunned congregation, the sabotage, the survival, the kindness of Abdul's family, the slow return of memories. Many wept, moved by the triumph of love over hatred and prejudice. Standing before the same priest who had been about to marry him to Ava, Rian turned to Madeline. Marry me, again, right now. She looked around at the cathedral's grandeur. Here? No, he smiled, looking more alive than he had in months. I know exactly where we should do this. 2 hours later, they stood in Desta's Ethiopian restaurant, surrounded by those who had truly supported their love. Desta herself performed a traditional Ethiopian blessing. Barbie, who had refused to attend the cathedral wedding, cried tears of joy. James stood as best man again, this time with a genuine smile. Their second wedding was smaller than their first, but infinitely more joyous. The jazz quartet played La Vie en Rose as they danced, her blue dress swirling, his bow tie undone, both of them laughing and crying at the miracle of their reunion. Abdul and his family, flown in from the Maldives as honored guests, watched with pride as the woman they had saved danced with her reclaimed love. Their simple goodness had defeated calculated evil, their humanity triumphing over prejudice. As night fell over New York City, the small restaurant filled with music, laughter, and the smell of Ethiopian coffee, Madeline and Rian held each other close, knowing that their love had been tested by fire and had emerged stronger than ever. Welcome back to our world, Rian whispered. Our world, Madeline agreed, where love makes the rules. The final redemption, a mother's last words. The Women's Metropolitan Correctional Center was a far cry from Eleanor Edwards' Manhattan penthouse. Gone were the silk sheets and French perfumes, replaced by standard-issue cotton and the harsh smell of industrial cleaner. 6 months into her sentence for attempted murder and conspiracy, Eleanor's perfectly maintained facade had crumbled along with her world. The trial had been sensational, making headlines across the globe. Society matron plots daughter-in-law's death, screamed the New York Post. Prejudice and privilege, the Edward family scandal, declared the Times. Eleanor had watched her social circle dissolve, her carefully cultivated reputation shatter, and worst of all, her son's complete rejection of everything she had tried to preserve. But it was the quiet moments in her cell that truly broke her. Night after night, she relived her choices, haunted by the hatred that had driven her to attempt the unthinkable. The face that stared back at her from the small mirror above her steel sink was no longer that of Manhattan's elite. It was the face of a woman who had lost everything in pursuit of preserving what didn't matter. The first signs of her illness weren't dramatic, just a persistent cough, then fatigue that seemed to seep into her bones. When the prison doctor delivered the diagnosis, aggressive lung cancer, metastasized, Eleanor felt a bitter laugh bubble up. After all her pretense of illness to manipulate Rian, fate had delivered the real thing. As her condition deteriorated rapidly, Eleanor found herself facing the one thing money and social status couldn't buy: time. The prison hospice wing became her final residence, the sterile white walls a blank canvas for her regrets. It was there, in the growing awareness of her mortality, that true change began to take root in Eleanor's heart. She watched the hospice nurses, women of every color and background, care for her with a humanity she had never shown others. Her roommate, a grandmother from Harlem serving time for protecting her grandson, shared stories of her own family's struggles against prejudice that made Eleanor weep with shame. "I need to write to them," she told her lawyer one grey morning, "before it's too late." The letter took days to compose. Her once elegant handwriting had grown shaky, but her words flowed from a place of genuine repentance. "My dearest Rianne and Madeline, as I face my final moments, the weight of my actions crushes my soul. My prejudice and hatred blinded me to the beauty of your love. Madeline, you were the daughter-in-law any mother should have been proud to have, kind, strong, and loving. You possessed every quality I claimed to value, yet I allowed the color of your skin to blind me to the brilliance of your spirit. Rianne, my beloved son, forgive me for letting my ignorance poison what should have been your happiest days. You saw what I couldn't, that love transcends all the artificial barriers we create. You showed true strength in standing up to my bigotry, and in doing so, you proved yourself a better person than I ever was. The Edward legacy I fought so desperately to protect was never about social standing or racial purity. The true legacy should have been love, courage, and the strength to stand up for what's right. You both embody these qualities far more than I ever did. I die knowing I don't deserve your forgiveness, but hoping that my remorse might bring you some peace. Love knows no color, no class, no boundaries. I learned this lesson too late, but perhaps my story can serve as a warning to others who would let prejudice poison their hearts. The doctors say I have very little time left. My final wish is not to see you marry someone else, as it once was, but simply to know that you both found happiness despite my attempts to destroy it. Your love story will be the true Edward legacy, one of triumph over prejudice, of good in conquering evil, of love defeating hate. With deep regret and eternal sorrow, Mother. The letter arrived at Rianne and Madeline's Manhattan apartment on a spring morning. They had just returned from visiting Abdul and his family in the Maldives, where they had established a foundation in his name to help other fishing villages. The foundation was their way of ensuring that the kindness that had saved Madeline would continue to touch other lives. Madeline read the letter first, her hands trembling slightly. Rianne watched her face, seeing the play of emotions across her features. When she finished, she handed it to him wordlessly, tears in her eyes. They arrived at the prison hospice wing that afternoon. Eleanor, pale and frail in her hospital bed, looked nothing like the formidable woman who had once commanded New York society. Her eyes filled with tears when she saw them. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "So very sorry." Madeline moved to the bed first, taking Eleanor's thin hand in hers. "We forgive you," she said simply. Rianne knelt beside his mother, adding his hand to theirs. In that moment, the last walls of hatred crumbled, washed away by tears of redemption. They stayed with her through the night, sharing stories of their happiness, their work with the foundation, their travels, their plans for the future. Eleanor listened with genuine interest, finally seeing the beauty of the love she had tried to destroy. As dawn broke over the city, Eleanor Edward took her last breath, her hand still clasped in Madeline's, her son's forgiveness the last thing she heard. She died not as the society matron who had let prejudice poison her soul, but as a mother who had finally learned the true meaning of love. The obituary in the Times made no mention of the scandal. Instead, it spoke of a woman who had learned life's most valuable lesson in her final days, that love, in all its forms, is the only legacy worth leaving. At the small, private funeral, Rianne and Madeline stood together, their hands clasped, their hearts heavy but at peace. The choir sang Amazing Grace, a hymn about redemption that seemed particularly fitting. She found her grace in the end, Madeline said softly. Because of you, Rian replied. Your capacity for forgiveness taught her what my years of obedience never could. They had decided to use the Edward fortune to establish a second foundation. This one in Eleanor's name, dedicated to fighting prejudice and promoting understanding across racial and social divides. It would stand as a testament to the power of redemption and the possibility of change, even in the hardest of hearts. As they left the cemetery, the spring sun broke through the clouds, casting a warm glow over the city. Life would go on, love would continue to grow, and their story would serve as a reminder that it's never too late to open one's heart to truth and acceptance. Love's legacy. 10 years later. A warm Los Angeles morning dawned over a Spanish-style villa nestled in the Hollywood Hills. The sound of children's laughter echoed through the garden where 8-year-old Grace Eleanor Edward chased her 5-year-old brother Abdul James Edward around the fountain. Their parents, Madeline and Ryan, watched from the veranda, their hands intertwined, their love deeper than ever after a decade of marriage. The years had been kind to them both. Madeline's success in pharmaceutical innovation had led to breakthrough treatments becoming accessible in developing nations. Rian had transformed Edward Enterprises into a global leader in sustainable development, their joint ventures building schools and hospitals in communities that needed them most. Their home had become a gathering place for people from all walks of life. On this particular Sunday morning, their weekly brunch brought together an unlikely family. Desta, now retired but still making her famous Ethiopian coffee. Abdul Rahman and his wife, who visited regularly from the Maldives to see their adopted grandchildren. Barbie, whose tech empire now focused on connecting underprivileged communities. And James, whose civil rights law firm had become the nation's most respected. Little Grace, named for both Madeline's mother and the grace that had allowed them to forgive Eleanor, had her grandmother's pearls preserved in a special box. But unlike Eleanor, she would grow up learning they symbolized not status, but the strength found in overcoming prejudice. Young Abdul, named for the fisherman who had saved their love story, had his father's kind eyes and his mother's determined spirit. The Edward Family Foundation, born from Eleanor's redemption, had grown beyond their wildest dreams. Its annual Bridges of Love scholarship program sent hundreds of underprivileged students to college each year. The foundation's headquarters in New York had transformed Eleanor's former penthouse into a cultural center where people of all backgrounds came together to learn, share, and grow. As they sat surrounded by their chosen family, Madeline and Rian reflected on their journey. The hatred that had nearly destroyed them had instead become the catalyst for profound change. Their story, now taught in social justice programs, showed that love could indeed conquer prejudice, but more importantly, that forgiveness had the power to transform tragedy into triumph. "Tell us again how you met," Grace begged, climbing into her mother's lap, though she'd heard the story countless times. "Well, my love," Madeline began, sharing a smile with Rian. "It all started at a business meeting, where your Aunt Barbie played matchmaker." As their story unfolded once more, the morning sun cast a golden glow over the gathering, illuminating the truth they had learned, that love, in its purest form, knows no boundaries of race, class, or prejudice. That forgiveness, even in the face of the gravest wrongs, has the power to heal not just hearts but generations. That family isn't defined by blood or status, but by the capacity of hearts to expand and embrace. Their journey had proved that sometimes the greatest love stories aren't just about two people finding each other, but about the power of that love to change the world around them. Through their foundations, their work, and most importantly through their children, Madeline and Rian had created a legacy far more valuable than the one Eleanor had tried so desperately to protect, a legacy of love, acceptance, and the courage to stand up for what's right. And so, their story continues, not just as a tale of love triumphant, but as a beacon of hope for all those who dare to love across the boundaries that society draws. For in the end, it is not our differences that define us, but our capacity to love beyond them. A message to our readers. Dear hearts, love is not just an emotion, it's a revolution. When we choose to love despite the world's prejudices, we become warriors in the most important battle of all, the fight for human dignity and understanding. Remember that true love requires courage, the courage to stand up to prejudice, to forgive those who wrong us, and to believe that one heart touching another can create ripples that change the world. Let this story be more than entertainment. Let it be a call to action. Look into your own heart. Examine your prejudices. Choose love over hate, understanding over judgment, forgiveness over bitterness. For in the end, we are all part of one human family, and the only legacy worth leaving is a world where love knows no bounds. With hope for a future where stories like this are no longer necessary. The author. For love is not just about finding the right person, but being the right person. A person who chooses love over prejudice, courage over comfort, and truth over tradition. Madeline and Rian Edward, from their autobiography, Love Beyond Boundaries.